FBI, we need to ask you some questions.
It started like any other evening, the kind that smelled faintly of pine and freshly brewed coffee. The cabin, tucked deep in the mountains, had always been my escape. Quiet, timeless, a place where the world felt far away. The fire crackled lazily in the stone hearth, throwing ribbons of amber light across the wooden beams, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. I had no idea how fragile that peace really was. Earlier that week, I'd noticed small things. The way he avoided my eyes when I mentioned the cabin, the sudden phone calls that ended when I walked in, the uneasy silence that followed. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was stress or work or anything but what it really was. After all, what reason would I have to suspect that the one place I loved most had already been sold? Behind my back, for less than a fraction of its worth. By the time dinner rolled around that night, the table was set, the candles flickered low, and laughter filled the air. Everything seemed perfect, until the sharp knock at the door cut through the hum of conversation. 3 men stood there, dark suits, solemn faces, badges gleaming in the dim light, and in that instant, the night, and my life, shifted forever. It was a cold morning when the first thread of truth began to unravel. The kind of morning where the fog clung to the pine trees, and the air smelled like rain and old wood. She had woken up with a sense of unease that she couldn't quite name, something restless under her skin, as if the world was whispering that something had shifted without her consent. The cabin had always been her sanctuary, a place she had designed herself, every piece of wood chosen, every color painted with intention. It wasn't just a building, it was her freedom, her escape from the noise of everything else. And yet, when she tried to access the property records online to review some maintenance details, she noticed something strange. Her name wasn't there anymore. At first, she thought it was a clerical mistake. The system must have glitched, she told herself. Maybe the county updated their records or switched formats. But the more she clicked, the more her stomach turned. The owner's name had changed, replaced by someone she had never heard of. A man named Daniel Frost. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the legal documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she saw the date of sale stamped clearly. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago she had been sitting at that same cabin sipping coffee on the porch, never knowing that it no longer belonged to her. Her first instinct was denial. There was no way it could be real. She picked up her phone, called the county office, and waited as the line clicked through layers of polite bureaucracy. When the clerk confirmed it, the cabin had indeed been sold. She felt the air leave her lungs. The transaction was registered, the payment recorded, and the signatures verified. But her name wasn't anywhere on those papers. She wasn't consulted, informed, or even acknowledged. It was as if she had been erased from something she had built with her own hands. The drive to the cabin that afternoon felt endless. The road, usually so familiar, now felt alien. Every turn of the tires seemed to echo her disbelief. When she arrived, everything looked exactly as she left it, the white curtains fluttering gently in the window, the garden still blooming with late summer flowers, the smell of cedar drifting from the porch. But there was a new padlock on the front door. She stood there staring at it, the metallic glint catching the light like an accusation. She called him. Her voice was steady at first, too steady, the kind of calm that comes right before something breaks. He didn't answer. The call went straight to voicemail, then another, and another. Hours later, when he finally returned her call, his tone was casual, too casual, as if they were discussing the weather. When she demanded an explanation, he sighed and said something about needing liquidity and temporary arrangements. He told her not to overreact, that it was all under control, that he would buy it back when things stabilized. But she could hear the lie in his voice. It was the same tone he used when he was caught hiding something before. Smooth, rehearsed, and detached. That night she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed every moment of their recent months together. The missed calls, the long absences, the cryptic messages. She had thought they were just symptoms of distance or stress. Now, they looked like breadcrumbs leading to betrayal. She searched through their financial documents, and the more she dug, the worse it got. Money had been quietly disappearing from their accounts, transferred through layers of names and companies she didn't recognize. And right there, buried in one of those transfers, was the $60,000, the exact amount listed on the sale. Her stomach turned. The cabin had been worth nearly 10 times that amount. Selling it for $60,000 wasn't just reckless, it was deliberate. Someone had benefited from it, and it wasn't her. The betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about the way he had looked her in the eyes while making plans that excluded her completely. She drove back to the cabin one last time that week, just to see it, to feel it, to remind herself that it was real. But when she arrived, a car she didn't recognize was parked out front, and two men were unloading boxes from the trunk. They nodded politely when she approached, assuming she was a neighbor. She couldn't bring herself to correct them. She stood there in silence, the wind rustling through the trees, and realized that her home, her safe place, now belonged to strangers. Every board, every nail, every quiet memory that once belonged to her had been traded away like an afterthought. It wasn't until she saw the deed with the official stamp, her husband's signature neatly beside the buyer's, that it truly sank in. He hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't been desperate. He had made a choice, and she was never meant to find out. When she finally saw the number, $60,000, it didn't make sense. Her first reaction was disbelief, a kind of stunned silence that made everything around her go still. The luxury cabin wasn't some worn-down vacation shack, it was a masterpiece. 2 stories of hand-polished cedar, panoramic windows overlooking the lake, and a wraparound deck that caught the morning light like glass. It had taken years to build, every part of it paid for and planned with care. The land alone was worth more than that, let alone the structure. Yet there it was in black and white, an official sale record stating the property had been sold for a mere $60,000, less than the value of the furniture inside. Her first thought was that it had to be a clerical error. She stared at the figure again, refreshing the page, hoping it would change, but it didn't. She called the real estate office listed on the deed, her voice shaking as she asked for clarification. The woman on the other end hesitated before confirming that yes, the sale had gone through, and yes, that was the correct price. When she asked how something like that could happen, the woman sighed quietly and said the buyer had been a close associate of the seller. That phrase stayed with her, a close associate. It wasn't just a bad deal, it was manipulation. The realization hit her like a slow, cold wave. He hadn't sold the cabin because they needed money. He had sold it to someone he knew, someone who could flip it, move funds, and make it disappear. It was a betrayal so deep that it took her breath away. She tried to piece together his motives. The recent business troubles, the evasive conversations, the sudden insistence that their finances were complicated. Every excuse he had ever given now seemed like a calculated distraction. She sat at the dining table that night, staring at the paperwork spread before her, the numbers printed neatly on each page. The total sale amount was circled, almost mockingly. She thought of the countless weekends she had spent at that cabin, painting the trim, planting flowers by the lake, waking up to mist curling over the water. Every corner had been touched by her hands, every moment tied to a memory. And now, all of it had been reduced to a sum so small it felt insulting. $60,000, the price of betrayal, written in ink. She started doing her own research. The buyer, Daniel Frost, had no real online presence. His name appeared on a few shell company registrations, each one recently created. The sale had gone through quickly, with no listing, no open house, and no public record of offers. It was a private transfer, slipped under the radar. She realized then that it wasn't incompetence or panic, it was deliberate laundering. The cabin had been used as a pawn, a piece in a financial scheme she hadn't even known existed. Her anger came slowly, in waves. At first it was disbelief, then confusion, then the sharp sting of humiliation. He had looked her in the eyes every day while knowing exactly what he had done. He had sat at their table, eaten her food, smiled at her across candlelight, and never once faltered. The audacity of it made her hands shake. She began gathering evidence, screenshots, transaction records, communication logs. Somewhere deep down she knew this wasn't just a personal betrayal. Something about the number didn't feel random. It was too clean, too precise, too coordinated. She went to the bank the next morning to inquire about the funds. The teller looked nervous, glancing between her and the screen before saying the account tied to the sale had already been emptied. The entire $60,000 had been wired to another institution out of state within hours of the transaction clearing. No delay, no hesitation. It was as if he had planned it all down to the minute. As she left the bank, she realized just how calculated the whole thing had been. The cabin had been sold for far less than its value, not because it was worthless, but because undervaluing it made it harder for anyone to trace. It was a perfect cover, a way to move money discreetly, to clean something dirty under the guise of a simple property transfer. What she didn't yet know was that the number, $60,000, would later become the key that unlocked everything. The FBI investigation, the missing funds, the secret accounts. But for now, it was just a number that hollowed her out from the inside. She sat in her car outside the cabin that evening, the same one she no longer owned, watching the sunset spill across the lake. The reflection shimmered on the water like fire, and she thought about how easily something beautiful could be sold, devalued, stripped of meaning. She ran her hand along the worn leather of the steering wheel, her jaw tightening as she whispered the number under her breath again and again, as if saying it enough times would make it make sense. $60,000, the cost of everything she had built, everything she had trusted, and everything that had just begun to crumble. The moment she realized the cabin had been sold for $60,000, she knew there had to be more to the story. That number didn't fit. It wasn't just low, it was deliberate, too specific, too tidy to be a mistake. She had seen him struggle with finances before, but this wasn't about paying debts or emergencies. This felt like a cover. And when she started digging deeper, what she found began to twist her understanding of everything she thought she knew about their life together. It started small, with a few late-night searches on the shared laptop, the same one he used for work. He had always been cautious, deleting his browsing history, locking files behind obscure passwords, but small traces remained. She noticed encrypted emails, transfers between accounts that didn't exist a month ago, and payment confirmations linked to company names that seemed made up. At first, she thought maybe it was just a business deal, something harmless. But the deeper she looked, the stranger it became. One of the companies, the one listed on the cabin sale, had been incorporated only 6 weeks before the transaction. It had no website, no listed address, no employees. When she checked its registration, the contact information led to a P.O. box in another state. The more she dug, the clearer it became that these weren't legitimate operations. They were shells, placeholders created to move money through invisible channels. The first true shock came when she pulled up a transaction history on one of their joint accounts. Several transfers had been made over the past few months, each one just under $10,000, small enough to avoid triggering any bank reporting thresholds. The amounts always varied slightly, and the recipient accounts were always different. Yet every transfer had one thing in common: they all circled back, eventually, to an entity tied to the same fake company that bought the cabin. It was all right there, hidden in plain sight, masked by layers of simplicity. Her pulse quickened as she pieced it together. The cabin sale wasn't just about quick cash. It was part of something larger, a network of quiet movements, shuffling money between fronts to hide where it truly came from. She had lived alongside it, completely unaware. Every dinner conversation about delays at work, every sigh about business complications, now looked like part of a performance. He had been preparing for months, slowly setting up a structure that would protect him if anything ever went wrong. She sat in the dim glow of her study that night, papers spread across the table, her phone lighting up every few minutes as she took screenshots, downloaded statements, and followed trails that seemed endless. There were payments from companies she'd never heard of, wired to offshore accounts, sometimes through cryptocurrencies. Some of the names looked like they belonged to small import-export businesses, others to tech startups, but none of them actually existed when she searched the registry. Each one seemed designed for one purpose: to make money disappear. Her mind spun with questions. Where was the money really coming from? Why was he so desperate to hide it? The thought that she might be living inside something criminal, something federal, chilled her. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but a deeper instinct told her to stay quiet. If he was willing to sell the cabin without a word, What else was he capable of? Over the next few days, she began noticing his behavior more carefully. He had started taking more calls outside, stepping out to get better reception. He'd become oddly protective of his phone, keeping it face down, locking it even for short moments. When he came home, there was always a new explanation, new stress at work, new clients, new excuses. But beneath it all, there was a current of fear. He was nervous. His hands fidgeted more. He checked the windows at night. And once, when she asked about a message that popped up on his screen, he snapped in a way she had never seen before. She knew then that whatever he was tangled in went far beyond them. And the worst part was realizing she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Her name was still linked to some of those accounts. Her signature was on shared forms, tax documents, business filings. If this web of lies unraveled, it would lead straight to her too. She started keeping copies of everything. Paper trails, screenshots, bank logs. She stored them under a new email, hidden from every shared device. Some part of her hoped it was all just paranoia, that maybe she was reading too much into things. But that illusion faded fast when she received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end introduced himself calmly, saying he was from a federal department conducting a financial review. He asked a few standard questions about the cabin sale, her husband's business activities, and whether she was aware of recent wire transfers. Her heart pounded. The call didn't last long, but the tone was enough to confirm what she already feared. Someone, somewhere, was watching. The sale wasn't random, the money wasn't clean, and the pattern of small, careful transactions was starting to draw attention from people who knew exactly what to look for. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them pointed to an innocent explanation. Dinner that night had been meant to be ordinary, a small attempt at normalcy in a life that no longer felt steady. The table was set with the good plates, the ones they usually saved for guests, and soft music played from the corner speaker. She had spent the afternoon trying to calm herself, telling herself to wait for answers, to act as if everything was fine. She even lit candles, their flames flickering gently in the dim room, as though she could coax some warmth back into a space that had grown cold with secrets. Outside, dusk settled over the street, a quiet evening falling into place. The knock came just as she set the last dish on the table. It wasn't loud or urgent, just 3 sharp raps, measured and precise. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, maybe a delivery left at the wrong house. But when she opened the door, the sight that greeted her froze her in place. 3 men stood there, dressed in dark suits, their faces serious and unreadable. The gold badges clipped to their belts glinted under the porch light. The letters FBI, stark and unmistakable, caught her eye immediately. For a moment, no one spoke. She could hear the faint hum of their black sedan parked at the curb, its engine still running. The taller of the 3 introduced himself in a low, calm voice, asking if they could come in to speak with her. Her mind scrambled for an answer, but her body moved automatically, stepping back to let them in. They entered the house with quiet professionalism, their eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with the precision of people who already knew where they were and why. She guided them to the dining room, the smell of roasted chicken and herbs still heavy in the air. The contrast felt surreal. Her carefully arranged table, the flickering candlelight, and these federal agents standing stiffly by the chairs. Her husband glanced up from his phone, his expression shifting in an instant from confusion to something tighter, more guarded. He stood slowly, his chair scraping the floor, and for a moment, everything went silent except for the soft hiss of the candles. The lead agent placed a small folder on the table, its corner brushing against the edge of a plate. He spoke calmly, his voice firm but not unkind, as he asked a series of questions. They were simple at first, names, dates, addresses, but each one carried a weight she could feel in her chest. When the agent mentioned the cabin, she felt the air thicken. Her husband's jaw clenched. He tried to answer, his words careful, deliberate, but she could hear the tremor beneath them. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself not to react. She noticed everything, the way the agents never broke eye contact, the way one of them subtly recorded the conversation, the faint tension in her husband's posture. He had always been good under pressure, but she could see the cracks forming now. Sweat gathered at his temple, his fingers tapped against the table, a small, nervous rhythm. The agents asked about the sale price, about the buyer's name, about transfers linked to the transaction. Each question seemed to land like a stone, and with every answer, her husband grew more defensive. She could see the moment he realized they weren't here for casual inquiries. They already knew the answers. They weren't looking for information. They were confirming it. The air in the room felt heavy, almost electric. The clink of silverware against plates had stopped. Even the music had gone silent, as if the world outside had faded away. She could hear the steady tick of the clock on the wall, marking each second as the agents circled closer to what they were after. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but outwardly she stayed calm, her face a mask. She didn't know if she was more afraid of the men in suits or the man sitting across from her. One of the agents slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the deed, the cabin sale, with signatures she recognized immediately. Her husband didn't reach for it. Instead, he sat back, his eyes flicking toward her just briefly, a flash of something between guilt and calculation crossing his face. She realized then that this was no misunderstanding. They were here because of what he had done. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate what would happen next. She wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but something told her to stay silent. The agents were polite, but there was an edge to their presence, an undercurrent of urgency she couldn't ignore. This wasn't a warning. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that had already been set in motion. She stared at the candles flickering on the table, their flames bending as a draft swept through the room. Dinner sat untouched between them, steam still rising from the dishes. The normalcy she had tried to create had dissolved, replaced by the stark reality of federal agents standing in her home, their eyes fixed on her husband, their questions cutting through the air like blades. In that moment, everything she thought she understood about her life tilted, and she knew nothing would be the same again. The conversation that night didn't end when the FBI agents left. It lingered in the walls, in the air, in the silence that filled every room afterward. As soon as the front door closed behind them, she turned to him, waiting for an explanation. But he didn't offer one. He didn't even look at her at first. Just stood there, his hands pressed against the table, his breathing shallow. The tension that had been simmering for weeks now felt like it might explode. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. She asked him what they were investigating, what they meant when they said they were following the money. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said it was all a misunderstanding, that his business partners had made a few risky investments, and the feds were just checking the books. But the more he spoke, the less convincing he became. His explanations were too practiced, too smooth, and yet his eyes betrayed him. They were darting, restless, filled with the kind of fear that couldn't be disguised. She pressed further. Why had he sold the cabin? Who was the buyer, really? Why were there fake companies connected to their accounts? The more questions she asked, the angrier he became. He raised his voice, accusing her of not trusting him, of overreacting, of letting those agents get in her head. But anger wasn't enough to mask the panic that flickered underneath. She could see it in the way his hands shook when he poured himself a drink, in the way he avoided her gaze entirely. Eventually, the truth began to slip out, not in one confession, but in fragments. He had been involved in a series of financial deals that weren't entirely legal. It started small, he said, with consulting fees that didn't need to be reported. Then temporary loans moved through shell companies to make certain profits look clean. The cabin sale was part of that. A transfer used to hide funds that were never meant to be traced. The $60,000 wasn't the real value. It was the cover for a much larger amount that had already changed hands in quiet deals overseas. She listened in disbelief, her stomach twisting tighter with every word. He said he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he was just helping out some partners who needed the money to move discreetly. But it was too late for excuses. The FBI didn't show up at someone's door over small bookkeeping errors. They came because they had evidence, because something big had already broken open. She tried to stay composed, to think clearly, but her mind was spinning. Everything she had once believed about him, his business success, his long hours, the expensive dinners he called networking, all of it had been built on lies. The man who had promised her security and stability had been laundering money under her roof, using their home, their accounts, even her name, to make it look legitimate. When she asked if her name was on anything, he hesitated, and that pause told her everything. She demanded to know the truth, and finally, he admitted that some of the accounts were joint, that some of the transactions might have passed through her side too. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the enormity of it. If the investigation traced the money through their shared assets, she could be implicated. He had dragged her into it without warning, without consent, and without a single thought for what that meant. She backed away from him, her hands trembling. He tried to calm her, saying he would fix it, that he just needed time, but his words sounded hollow. He wasn't trying to protect her anymore. He was trying to protect himself. And for the first time, she could see that he wasn't the victim of a bad deal or a misunderstanding. He was part of something organized, calculated, and deliberate. That night, after he went upstairs, she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates still on the table. The candle wax had hardened, the food gone cold, but she didn't move. Her mind replayed every small sign she had ignored: the sudden influx of money months earlier, the overseas calls he brushed off, the briefcases he never let her touch. Each memory felt like a clue she had missed in a story that was unfolding long before she knew it existed. Later, when she checked his office, the proof was all there. Files hidden in drawers, encrypted USB drives, papers stamped with names that matched the companies she had seen online. The web was vast, interconnected, and impossible to untangle in one night. She realized then that the FBI agents hadn't come with questions. They had come because they already knew who he was and what he had done. They were giving him a chance to cooperate, or watching to see if he'd try to run. She stood in the doorway of his office, the hum of the house suddenly deafening. The life they had built together, the house, the cars, the comfort, had been funded by something rotten beneath the surface, and she was standing at the edge of it, torn between disbelief and fury. The man sitting upstairs, the one she had trusted more than anyone, was no longer just her husband. He was a suspect, and now, so was she. The next morning she woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the light filtering through the curtains, trying to piece together everything that had unraveled. The night before still replayed in her mind. The knock at the door, the agent's calm voices, the way his lies finally came tumbling out. It was as if her entire world had shifted in the span of a few hours, leaving her standing in the wreckage of a life built on deceit. But beneath the numbness, something else began to take root. A sharp, cold determination. She realized that waiting for him to fix things would only destroy her further. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that he wasn't trying to protect her. He was trying to save himself. If the FBI was already investigating, her silence could be mistaken for complicity. Every document, every shared account, every financial signature tied her to him. And unless she acted fast, she would be dragged down with him. For years, she had trusted him with everything. Now she had to learn to trust herself. She started small. After he left that morning, claiming he had meetings to handle, she went into his office again. The drawers were locked, but she found the spare key in the bottom of his travel bag. Inside were neatly stacked folders, bank statements, offshore transfers, shell company paperwork. She took photos of everything, one by one, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. Each page told a story of careful deceit, money routed through fake businesses, assets hidden under different names, the cabin sale serving as just one piece of a much larger pattern. She uploaded the images to a cloud drive he didn't know existed, labeling them with dates and keywords. Then she printed copies of key documents, not many, just enough to show intent and connection. She hid them in an old cookbook in the kitchen, tucked between the pages where no one would think to look. Every step she took that morning felt deliberate, like she was reclaiming control one quiet action at a time. As the day went on, she began contacting people, a lawyer she trusted, a friend who worked in finance, and eventually the number left on one of the FBI cards from the night before. She didn't say much at first, only that she had information to share. The voice on the other end didn't sound surprised. They arranged a meeting for the next day, neutral ground, just to talk. She felt both terrified and relieved. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't waiting for the truth to destroy her. She was moving toward it herself. When her husband returned that evening, he was different. His usual confidence had vanished. He moved around the house distractedly, avoiding eye contact, muttering about pressure and watching what we say. She could tell he was spiraling. He asked if she had spoken to anyone, and she lied, saying no. His eyes narrowed for a moment, searching her face for cracks, but she kept her expression calm. She had learned from him how to wear composure like armor. That night she didn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the faint hum of his phone vibrating on the nightstand, the muffled conversations he took in the hallway when he thought she was asleep. Every sound was another reminder of how deep he had gone, how little of the man she'd married remained. The trust she once held for him had been replaced by a quiet resolve. If he had sold her home, her peace, and her name for money, then she would take back the one thing he couldn't control, the truth. The next morning she drove to the meeting point, a small cafe off the main road, nondescript and quiet. The agent she'd spoken to was already there, waiting with a notepad and a calm expression. When she slid the envelope of copies across the table, her hands didn't shake. She explained everything: the cabin sale, the fake accounts, the hidden files, the arguments, the fear. The agent listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, taking notes. When she was finished, he told her what she already suspected: the investigation was bigger than her husband. He was connected to a ring of financial crimes that stretched across several states. The cabin sale had been one of many fraudulent transfers used to mask illegal funds. She felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. It hurt to hear it confirmed, but there was also freedom in the truth. For the first time, she was no longer a pawn in his secret world. She was a witness. She left the meeting with instructions: stay quiet, stay cooperative, and stay alert. They would handle the rest. When she returned home, she found him sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. He tried to speak, but she didn't let him. She simply told him she knew everything. The look on his face was one she would never forget. Part shock, part realization, part fear. He understood, in that instant, that she wasn't the same woman he had manipulated all this time. She walked past him, her footsteps calm, her voice steady as she told him the truth. That she had already spoken to the FBI, that she wasn't going to protect him, and that whatever came next was his own doing. He didn't follow her when she left the room. The silence that followed wasn't the uneasy quiet of before. It was final, like the sound of a door closing that would never open again. In the end, the truth didn't just expose him, it freed her. What began as disbelief over a sold cabin unraveled into a revelation that the life she thought she had was built on lies and crime. The betrayal was devastating, but it also forced her to rediscover her own strength. She learned that silence protects the guilty, and truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to freedom. The cabin he sold for $60,000 became more than a symbol of loss. It became the line between the woman she was and the one she became. When the FBI took him away, she didn't cry. She simply watched the car disappear down the road, her heart steady. He had traded everything for greed, and she had reclaimed everything that mattered: her dignity, her peace, and the power to start over on her own terms.